One of the things I work hard for in this organization is to see how we can teach math and science more classically, more in the classical tradition. What sort of pedagogy should we use? What sort of content should we be demonstrating, discussing, translating, transmitting to our students? And so an important passion of mine. So what I want to do today is hopefully demonstrate to you a particular approach to teaching a science lesson. I'm a biologist by trade, hence I chose a biology lesson. This is something I've used in the classroom. Since I've used it, it's gone through endless revisions and refinements, and it's become broader and bigger in scope and so on. To where I could say this lesson now, if I were to use it in my classroom, I could probably spend, if I wanted to, 2 to 3 weeks on the content that can be developed through this one lesson in class. And although the subject may be wolves, the point of this is to show how this is just a launching point for lots of interesting discussions that can come up. 3 things I'd like to say about teaching science in a more classical tradition. One is that in order to accomplish it, we can talk about pedagogy and content and so on, but it really comes down to what Jonathan Yonan was saying, which is heart. What are we trying to instill in our kids? What do we want them to take away? So something that I would want them to take away from this lesson is a greater sense of self and belonging to the natural world. We as humans have this tendency to distance ourselves from nature, to think ourselves as higher, better, not part of it. And yet our lives are rooted and grounded in the physical world around us. And in fact, the liberal arts exists in order to describe reality. As such, that leads me to point number 2. Science has the best opportunity, I believe, within a liberal arts curriculum, within a classical tradition. Science has the best opportunity to describe reality and to instill a sense of wonder in our students. As a science teacher, it should be your aim to have your class be everyone's favorite class, because it's the easiest class. I've taught literature, I've taught other subjects. Science is the easiest class to engage students in, because there are so many avenues of engagement, so many skills involved, so many thought processes. And above all, science can instill that sense of curiosity and that sense of wonder about the world around us. And we know this instinctively, but we sometimes forget that explanations do not take away curiosity. Right? Explanations actually only enrich the questioning. Confucius said the wise man has more questions than answers. But actually science, we know, works in a sort of fractal nature. You can zoom in, you can zoom out. The questions never end. The patterns that are important seem to repeat themselves. And that should be a source of endless curiosity for us. And I truly believe that. So firstly, we need to use science as a vehicle for discovery, for expression. It is probably the best opportunity we have to engage our students in this. But I recently was reading something here, a great book, Beauty for Truth's Sake. And it's all about the use of curiosity and wonder for unveiling truth about the world. And I wanted to read the author's points on how this might relate to math and science teaching. The author is Stratford Caldecott, an Oxford-trained scholar, and preeminent in the classical education movement taking place in Europe right now. This quote begins with a phrase, symptoms of our educational crisis. Just to frame that, the crisis he's talking about is the lack of meaning, the lack of depth, and the lack of character formation that progressive modern schooling has suffered from. He says this, symptoms of our educational crisis, such as the fragmentation of the disciplines, the separation of faith and reason, the reduction of quality to quantity, and the loss of a sense of ultimate purpose, are directly related to a lack of historical awareness on the part of our students. An integrated curriculum must teach subjects, and it must teach the right subjects, but it should do so by incorporating each subject, even math and the hard sciences, within the history of ideas, which is the history of our culture. Every subject has a history, a drama, and by imaginatively engaging with these stories, we become part of the tradition. That is my goal today. My goal today is to share with you a historical drama that has taken place in our own backyard and use that as a point to engage a student in thinking about the great ideas. And so we begin with this idea of wolves here. And I have to play the sound through my laptop, so just give me a second here. Would you indulge me for a second and just, would you close your eyes? And would you imagine yourself in the woods for a moment? It could be a nice snowy day, whatever comes to mind. It could be a pleasant, warm evening. But you have to be alone. And in the woods, while you are enjoying what is happening around you, you may hear a sound. And I just want you to hear that sound. Whale, wolf, anyone unsure there? Now, just out of curiosity, indulge me. Does anything strike you about that sound? Is there any kind of response that you have to that noise? Concern? Yeah. Any other like physiological response, like innate, like you heard it and instinctively you felt sad? Because he's lonely. He sounds sad. Chills, though, instinct to run. This is really interesting, and actually I'm glad you said that, because those are the obvious answers. So I would begin this lesson, and I'm going to periodically break the fourth wall. I'm going to give you a demonstration lesson, but I'll try to stop occasionally and share with you why I'm doing certain things. First of all, auditory engagement or any kind of sensory engagement with a lesson just helps students understand, gives them a place in the story. But here's the first points I would make. Mankind fears wolves, right? There is this instinct that we have that wolves are bad. Important question to maybe ask is why? So let me ask you that question. Why do we instinctively, we hear that sound, and for many of us, their first instinct was fear or to run away. Any thought as to why? Why do we fear wolves? They're predators. Good. Yeah, you can give the obvious answers. It's fine. Do we think of wolves differently from other predators, though? We've been taught that wolves are bad. Yes, that's important. Go down that line for a minute. Why else do we think, why else are we scared of wolves? They could kill you. They're predators, yes. They're large, they're fast, they're strong, they snarl, and they're scary, right? So yes, we know these things, yeah. And we feel outnumbered, yeah. Yes, good. So culturally, right, we're taught that wolves are bad too. Right, this is getting at the heart of it, right? I listed a couple things that we could take away. One is cultural indoctrination. We heard about the big bad wolf. Werewolf myths are as old as Greco-Roman history, right? Secondly, there's religious indoctrination. In the Christian world, Satan is depicted as a wolf, and Satan's minions, the false prophets, are depicted as wolves in sheep's clothing, right? So over and over again, the image of wolves is bad. And then we have this sort of geographic indoctrination. Humankind has developed in proximity to wolves. And so they probably represent some form of competition or fear, but actually more importantly, they probably represent some form of wildness beyond the borders of our safe community that we can't control, right? And that fear is as old as Grendel. That fear is as old as Cain, right? When you lose the boundaries that you're safe within, and there is something dangerous outside of that, that represents a fear, and that seems to be deeply rooted in mankind. So there is actually a phrase for this. It's called evolutionary psychology, where there's some kind of deeply rooted instinctive mindset that seems to be inherited and passed on from generation to generation. And it's hard for us to even articulate the total causes. We can see some of the proximal things, but not every animal has the same instinctive reaction with humans as wolves. It seems to be one of the few. We could name some others. Snakes are another one, right? Spiders would be a third, and maybe sharks would make the list, right? Those are sort of the animals that we seem to have this sort of instinctive fear of in nature. Did I leave one off the list, or did that kind of cover it? Those seem to be the big ones. Bears? Are we scared of bears to the same extent that we're scared of wolves and snakes? I don't think so, but you might be right. What's interesting about that fear, though, is that wolves represent two things in our mind. They represent this wildness, this unconquerable wilderness that presents a threat to us, and yet at the same time, the wolf family and the wolf family history also represents one of our greatest conquests of wildness too, right? So we have this really close relationship with wolves in particular, dominated by fear and instinctive reactions. So here on this left, a very important map. Before the European colonists settled America, the gray wolf was rampant across the entire continent. The paler orange here is the former range of the wolf. Post-settlement, post-industrialization, the wolf range has shrunk dramatically to where it's primarily in more wilderness areas now. What is the fastest way to go from what the range that the wolves used to have to the range that the wolves currently occupy? Any thoughts? What is the fastest way to reduce the wolf population and isolate them to just wilderness areas? Hunting is actually the fastest way. And in fact, that's the history of wolves in the United States, that European settlers had this instinctive fear of wolves, and so it became culturally acceptable to eradicate wolves. And not only is there no restriction on wolf hunting, in fact, young people were actually encouraged, if they found even baby wolves, kill them now before they become a problem later. As evidence of that, here's a couple statements from a pastor of a New England church in the 17th century, describing the difficulties of colonization and settlement and the threats that they felt around them. But notice this, he says, there is a hellish and howling wilderness where none inhabited but hellish fiends and brutish men. This was the colonists' attitude towards the wilderness around them. And what are they really focusing on here? Wolves and Native Americans. Notice the attitude towards them, and notice the response was pretty similar, right? Restriction, culling, isolation. Again, he described the wilderness as the devil's den, where grim death and eternal night reign. The key word there is devil's den. Again, an allusion to wolves, right? They're describing the wilderness with this fearful approach. And wolves became symbolic of that fear. All of which leads us to this photograph, which is the pelt of the last known wild wolf to have been hunted in the contiguous United States. It was shot in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, and the pelt is now on display in a New York museum. And it happened in 1899, so it took about 250 years to hunt and kill all of the wolves that were in the United States. Yet, we can proudly say on 1899, we had eradicated the wolf from the United States. And in doing so, probably eliminated an entire species of wolf, the eastern gray wolf, which was a subspecies of the more famous timber wolf, the western gray wolf. And in doing so, I have made that wolf extinct. Don't we all feel our pride in having made our nation more secure? Or is it perhaps we made a mistake? Right? This is why this lesson is really interesting. And what I would propose is this, is that it's important to see what happened next. Now, this is a biology lesson, not a sociology lesson. I just wanted to frame it in this historical drama that we have the spear of wolves. But think about it for a moment biologically. Any idea what happened next? What were the biological consequences of having eradicated wolves? Any thoughts? Said explosion in deer population, yeah. Yeah, one animal in particular thrives when wolves aren't present, which is the coyote. And rampant coyote populations have significant impacts. So here's the, as it were, the hypothesis that I want to demonstrate to you. It is that a lack of wolves in the United States for a couple hundred years caused significant decline in biodiversity, fertility, and overall health of American wilderness areas for at least 100 years. And I say that because something happened after, about 100 years after the last wolf was shot. That is significant. Great evidence for this can be found in Yellowstone National Park because the University of Oregon studied Yellowstone National Park for decades and has lots of research. And here's just a little aside, I would say, as a teacher. I've taught this lesson about the importance of wolves in Yellowstone Park for years, until one day I sat down and thought, where does this information come from? How do we know about this story? And I began to look into the history of the research. And the more you dive into the actual research, the more important that background seems to become. And I would argue this as a result. When we talk about using primary sources in classical education, I would encourage you that in science, one of the best ways to incorporate primary sources is to go back to the original research, the original experiment, the original test, and find out what was actually said in those tests and those experiments. Because in science, too quickly, and I say this to you as science teachers, too quickly, we jump straight to the vocab and the definition and expect our students to understand the context without ever giving them the context. And so to be part of this historical drama, go back to the first time someone discovered that piece of information. Research yourself and deepen your own understanding of your subject matter and help the students frame that in the correct context. It does a remarkable job of broadening their minds. So what happened in Yellowstone National Park? On the left and on the right, same picture or same location in the park, Black-tailed Deer Creek, pictures taken approximately 12 years apart. And in all of these slides that I'm going to show you, the time span is roughly 12 to 15 years difference. There's always a before and after, right? Now notice on this case, upper left is the before, lower right is the after. So just name a couple things. What do you see as difference here? Just shout it out. More plant life. Has the river shrunk or it's covered over? Now that's important. Why would the river being covered over be significant? More places to hide. Yeah. Less erosion, yes, good. More temperature regulation, right, of the river, which in fact is changing essentially the environment. So good, these are some of the things I would hope that a student would be able to pick up on. Should be appearing on the screen. Yeah, this study's from Oregon State University. You have new growth, thicker ground cover, shade over water, important differences in the environment. In this case, the lower picture is the before, the upper picture is the after. These bushes are particularly important here in the top picture. Same location, same researcher even in the shot, 12 years apart, right? These are berry-producing bushes. So what do you notice here? Thicker undergrowth, more productivity, more berries being produced. Totally different environment. Notice the height of the shrubs, that gives ground cover and so on. The environment is very, very different. All of these show changes. On the left, you've got a progression of pictures, same location, same shot. Again, you see the same pattern, ground cover. Top A and B represent the same location, 12 years apart. C and D represent the same location, 12 years apart. C and D are interesting. What do we see there? New species, right? Not only a new species, but a new environment being created by that species. Very interesting pattern taking place. Why is Yellowstone Park transforming like this over the period of 12 years? If you've caught sight of the names of the studies that are being going on, you will see that the reason is right about the year 2005, gray wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone Park. And within 12 years, the reintroduction of wolves caused radical transformation of the environment. Radical transformation of the environment. This is why this lesson is really important. These researchers from Oregon State University had been studying this environment for a while. So, important lesson from this, the reintroduction of gray wolves into Yellowstone Park in 1995. I need to check that date. That's in conflict with what I just said. But that happens sometimes when you're speaking out loud, right? Now I don't remember which one it was. Either way, the introduction of wolves triggered a period of restoration and habitat rehabilitation that was as unexpected as it was rapid. Right? The number one thing in biology is, first of all, we can talk about biodiversity, and that's important in an environment. The biodiversity rapidly increased in those 15 years, and as a result, the wilderness was transformed. Now, you may not think of those low shrubs as being significant, but place yourself in that environment as an animal. You're providing shade cover for things like small rodents and small birds that previously they had not been able to have. The presence of those animals is going to draw in other predators that previously weren't there because there was no food for them and so on. There's all these attendant consequences of this transformation that are really important. This graphic was produced by the University of Oregon to try to demonstrate this. On the left is the environment without wolves, dominated by two species that we already mentioned, deer and coyotes. Right? And without wolves, deer and elk populations soared. What's the consequences of having rampant deer and elk populations running wild in the wilderness? Everything gets eaten. There's no ground cover because they eat everything, and there's no tree cover because they'll eat up as long as their necks will stretch up into the trees. As a result, the only animals that really thrive are your scavengers. And coyotes are known to be kind of ecosystem suppressors, that when you have a lot of coyotes, there's a lot of scavenging going on, it means that only animals at the lower end of the ecosystem are thriving. Right? Very interesting. However, after the wolves came along, first they scared off a lot of the coyotes, because their wolves are a lot larger. Secondly, of course, they helped to cull the deer and elk populations, but not just cull them, they helped to remove them from certain areas of the park. They became more migratory. And they weren't overgrazing in one area any longer because they had to keep on the move to keep away from the wolves. As a result, ground cover increased. The number of small rodents and fish and birds was able to increase because they had cover over the rivers and shrubs to hide in. As a result, fish populations increase. This begins to bring in other predators, things that are then able, hawks and foxes and so on, that are hunting different kinds of species. Biodiversity was rapidly expanding. They experienced the return of beavers, which had been completely lost in Yellowstone National Park for about 50 years, and yet they bring in wolves, and within a few years, beavers started to return. Now, beavers are important because they change the physical landscape around them. And by creating a marsh or a lake, they're creating even more new habitats for new species to exploit. What a remarkable process is taking place. And it all happened within our lifetime. Here, I want to show you this short video, which is something I love to share in class, about how wolves have actually changed the river system of Yellowstone National Park.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed. More pools formed. More riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Now that's a fascinating story, right? That is a story designed to at least give a sense of wonder to students, right? The fact that this behavior, they're not doing it on purpose, but their natural behavior actually has this huge influence. It's a remarkable thing. He mentioned at the very start of the video, trophic cascades, and it's become a subject of biological study in the last 50 years. Not just because this is the primary example, but this was one of the first times this phenomenon was ever actually documented in nature. And that's why this study takes on this added importance. This study of wolves has transformed our understanding of ecology and the interaction of species. So here's the remarkable thing, and as a teacher, this is why this is so fascinating. This is all preamble, this is all introduction, and think of all of the places that you can go from here, right? First of all, we have this concept of cascades. Now, you may have, since the pandemic, become more familiar with cascades in biology, right? Because it became a talking point in the pandemic. The word originates from this study in wolves and how the removal of wolves had these unintended but inevitable consequences, where from layer of the ecosystem to layer of the ecosystem, there was consequence, 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 until we got to a place that was, relatively speaking, arid, barren, and uninteresting, right? These wolves have no physical interaction with the plants, and yet they change the biodiversity of the producers in the environment. These wolves have no physical interaction with the rivers, and yet they changed the course and trajectory of rivers. Fascinating idea. Therefore, important thing to know in biology, we can call these animals keystone species. And if we begin to understand what that means, that's where one species has this unusually important impact on its environment. And from this, we've begun to see other examples. And here's just 3 other examples of keystone species. These are the ones that we really need to be careful about protecting, because the removal of one of these species will radically alter the environment around them. Has this cascade effect. Another thing we can talk about, the concept of ecosystem engineers, that some organisms, by their natural behavior, actually shape the environment for other species to thrive. Beavers are the classic example of this, because they will create a lake where there was not a lake, or a marsh where there was not a marsh, and then different species can take advantage of that. But none of us ever thought that the wolf might be one of those species. And yet, by its natural behavior, it had this ability to tend and improve the environment around it. Importance of apex predators. The importance of what should we really fear. Let's do this really fast, just because you'll like this one. What should we really be afraid of? The wolf around the corner, or an unproductive ecosystem? Here's an interesting survey, right? Deer populations are out of control because wolves were eradicated. Wolves have not caught up yet to the deer. But deer are far more important to us. There's an average of 1 million accidents per year involving a deer in a car. It costs anywhere from $1 to $4 billion in insurance money as a result. Deer kill on average 200 people a year in car collisions, and there are over 10,000 injuries as a result. And we live really close to the highest risk area in the United States, just so that you know. In comparison, how deadly are wolves? A study was done for 16 years and found there are only 489 wolf attacks around the world. Those first figures are just for the United States. Of those, 67 of them were predatory. The rest were either rabies or the wolf felt threatened, was cornered. Of those, only 26 of those attacks were actually fatal. So 26 fatal attacks in 16 years versus 200 deaths every year. Wolf attacks are very rare. I would argue that deer are far more of a threat to people than wolves are. And this reintroduction program has had mixed success. Last thing, just to note, and I'll speed up, is that from this, and I can send this out to anyone who asks, I have example assignments of things that I've done in class in response to this, things that have taken time. And there is an incredible seminar reading called Thinking Like a Mountain, where the writer Aldo Leopold, who's kind of like a Wendell Berry, talks about the environment. He says it's far more important to us to think like the mountain. The mountain fears the deer and welcomes the wolf, right? Because of this overpopulation, whereas we have this completely backwards attitude. This seminar reading can transform a student's understanding of what it means to be responsible in their environment and understand how we are part of nature and have a significant effect on it. So all of these things are possible as a result. This is why I'm saying this one short study could occupy weeks of learning in class and be a launching point for some really important things. I would love to go on, but I will be respectful of your time. So thank you for listening.